Why did Mark Selby destroy Neil Robertson at the China Open 2026? Neil Robertson arrived at the 2026 China Open with something very important to play for. He was not simply trying to win another tournament, he was trying to reclaim the world #1 ranking. Robertson had been playing some of his best snooker in recent weeks, and the China Open represented a huge opportunity. He was the defending champion, he was the #1 seed, and after victories over Chang Bingyu and Si Jiahui, Robertson had reached the quarterfinals looking increasingly dangerous. Then he faced Mark Selby, and everything changed. Because instead of another close battle between two world-class players, Selby produced one of the most convincing performances of the tournament. He beat Robertson 6-1, not 6-5, not 6-4, not a match decided on the final colours, 6 frames to 1. And the most important part was how Selby won them. He produced 2 century breaks and 4 additional breaks of more than 50 points, completely controlling the match for long periods. So why was Mark Selby able to destroy Neil Robertson when Robertson had looked so dangerous just 1 round earlier? The answer begins with the type of match Selby created. Because Selby did not try to beat Robertson at his own game, he did something much more dangerous. He took away the conditions Robertson needs to play his best snooker. Neil Robertson is one of the most devastating break builders in professional snooker. When he gets an open table, he can make the game look incredibly simple. A long red, perfect position, another red, a colour, and suddenly the frame is almost gone. That is why opponents cannot afford to give Robertson easy openings, and Selby understood that perfectly. Instead of giving Robertson a rhythm, Selby constantly made him work. The difference was obvious. Robertson wanted scoring opportunities, Selby wanted control. And control is something Mark Selby has built his entire career around. He is one of the best tactical players in the sport. He can turn a simple safety exchange into a 5-minute battle. He can move the cue ball a few inches and completely change the next decision. And most importantly, he is extremely comfortable when the match becomes uncomfortable. That is exactly what happened here. Robertson was never allowed to settle. And once Selby started scoring heavily, the Australian suddenly found himself facing the worst possible combination. A tactical player who was also scoring like an attacking specialist. That is when Mark Selby becomes incredibly difficult to beat. Because normally, you can try to solve one problem. If he is playing defensively, you can try to attack. If he is scoring heavily, you can try to fight fire with fire. But when Selby combines both sides of his game, the opponent has very few comfortable options. And that is what made this match so one-sided. Selby was not simply waiting for Robertson to make mistakes. He was actively creating pressure. Every safety exchange had a purpose. Every long pot had a purpose. Every positional shot was designed to make the next visit easier. And once he got into a scoring opportunity, he converted it. The statistics tell the story. 2 centuries, 4 additional 50-plus breaks. That is 6 substantial scoring visits in only 7 frames won. Robertson simply did not get enough opportunities to build momentum. And this is where the match became psychologically difficult for Robertson, because he had arrived in Taiyuan with confidence. Before facing Selby, he had already beaten Chang Bingyu 6-3. Then he defeated Si Jiahui 6-2, making a 102 break in the process. Robertson was scoring well. He was winning comfortably. And more importantly, he was playing with a clear objective. The possibility of returning to world #1 was becoming very real. In fact, before the quarterfinal, Robertson was only 3 victories away from taking the provisional #1 position. That meant this match was enormous, but Selby did not care about the ranking story. He only cared about the table, and that may have been one of the biggest differences between the two players. Robertson had something to lose. Selby had an opportunity, and once Selby established control, the pressure moved almost entirely onto Robertson. Suddenly, every missed red mattered, every safety error mattered, every frame Selby won made the comeback more difficult. And against Mark Selby, that is a very dangerous situation. Because Selby is one of those players who becomes more difficult to beat when he gets ahead. He does not need to rush. He does not need to produce spectacular shots. He can simply make the opponent play another difficult shot, then another, and another. Eventually, frustration appears, and frustration creates mistakes. That is how Selby has won so many important matches throughout his career. But there was something different about this particular performance. Selby was not merely grinding his way to victory, he was scoring. That is important, because one of the criticisms that sometimes follows Selby is that his matches can become heavily tactical. But here he combined his tactical game with elite break building. And that combination completely overwhelmed Robertson. Whenever Robertson got an opportunity, he needed to take it immediately, because there was no guarantee he would receive another one. And that is a terrible way to play against a player like Selby. You start taking slightly more risks, you try a difficult long pot, you try to force an opening, and suddenly you are playing the match on Selby's terms. This is probably the biggest tactical reason behind the 6-1 scoreline. Selby controlled when Robertson was allowed to attack. That is much more important than simply controlling possession. If you allow Robertson to attack whenever he wants, you are giving one of the best break builders in the world exactly what he wants. But if you force him to attack from difficult positions, his percentage drops, the risk increases, and Selby gets more opportunities. It becomes a cycle. Selby applies pressure. Robertson is forced into a difficult shot. Robertson misses or leaves a chance. Selby takes the table. Selby scores heavily, and Robertson has to start again. Once that cycle begins, a match can disappear very quickly, and that is exactly what happened. The most surprising part is that Robertson had every reason to believe he could win this match. His form coming into the quarter-final was strong. He had been practicing intensely after the Shanghai Masters. He had even spoken about how Ronnie O'Sullivan's attitude towards practice had influenced him. Robertson had reportedly spent huge amounts of time practicing in Beijing, and described himself as having worked without taking a day off. So this was not a player who arrived unprepared. He was motivated, he was practicing, he was scoring, he was chasing the world #1 ranking. And then Selby simply produced a level of snooker that Robertson could not handle. That tells us something important. This was not necessarily a case of Robertson suddenly playing terrible snooker. It was more about Selby not allowing him to play the snooker he wanted. That distinction matters. Because if Robertson had simply missed everything, the result would be easy to explain. But when a player loses 6-1 to Mark Selby, while Selby produces 2 centuries and multiple 50-plus breaks, the story is much more about the winner. Selby was simply better, and he was better in almost every important area: tactical control, break building, consistency, pressure, and conversion. Robertson needed something to change, but the match never really gave him the chance. Every time he needed a frame to build momentum, Selby responded. Every time Robertson needed Selby to make a mistake, Selby found a way to stay in control. And that is why the score became so brutal. At 1-1, everything would have still been open. At 2-1, Robertson could still have believed that the match was developing into a normal quarter-final. But once Selby began creating a significant gap, the psychological pressure became enormous. And once Selby reached 5 frames, Robertson was fighting for survival. At that point, there is no room for experimentation. There is no room for patience. You have to attack. But attacking against Selby when you are behind is exactly what he wants, because now he can use your desperation against you. This is one of the strange things about playing Mark Selby. When you are ahead against him, you can afford to be patient. When you are behind against him, patience becomes much harder, and that creates a trap. Robertson had to chase. Selby could wait. Robertson had to create something. Selby could simply respond. That is why the final score looks even more dramatic than the difference between the two players might suggest before the match. On paper, this should have been a blockbuster. The defending China Open champion against one of the most successful players of his generation. Instead, Selby turned it into a statement. And there is another interesting aspect to this victory. Selby's own tournament had already been impressive. He defeated Pang Junxu 6-3 in the opening round. Then he destroyed Kyron Wilson 6-1. So by the time Robertson arrived at the table, Selby was already playing with enormous confidence. That matters, because confidence in snooker can completely change a player's decision-making. When you are confident, a long red looks easier. A difficult safety feels more natural. You trust your cue action. You don't second-guess yourself. And Selby looked exactly like that. He was playing with authority. Robertson, meanwhile, suddenly found himself in a match where almost nothing was going his way. That is when the pressure starts becoming visible. You begin thinking about the score. You begin thinking about the previous frame. You begin thinking about the next frame. And suddenly you are no longer playing one shot at a time. Selby is very good at forcing opponents into that mental state. He keeps the pressure constant. He doesn't need to scream or celebrate. He simply keeps putting the opponent in difficult situations. And eventually something breaks. This time, Robertson broke first. There is also a bigger story behind the result. Robertson's hopes of reclaiming the world #1 ranking were effectively ended by the defeat. Before the quarterfinal, winning the China Open would have allowed him to move back above Judd Trump in the rankings, although the official change would not take effect until after the Wuhan Open. That opportunity is now gone, and for Robertson, that makes the defeat even more painful. He did not simply lose a quarterfinal. He lost a chance to turn a strong tournament into a major ranking achievement. But for Selby, this victory is enormous, because it sends a message to the rest of the draw. He is not simply surviving, he is playing at a very high level. And if Selby can maintain this combination of tactical control and scoring, he becomes one of the most dangerous players left in the tournament. The really frightening thing is that he doesn't need to play perfect attacking snooker. He can win frames in different ways. He can win them with a century. He can win them with a 70. He can win them through safety. He can win them on the colours. That versatility is what makes him so difficult to prepare for. Robertson, by comparison, is at his most dangerous when he can establish a rhythm. Give him open reds and he can destroy a frame. But Selby refused to give him that rhythm. And once he had the lead, he never allowed Robertson to recover. So, if we reduce the entire match to a few key reasons, the explanation becomes very clear. First, Selby's break building was exceptional. 2 centuries and 4 more 50-plus breaks in a 7-frame victory is an extraordinary scoring performance. Second, Selby controlled the tactical side of the match. He did not allow Robertson to dictate the pace or choose when to attack. Third, Robertson couldn't build momentum. He had looked excellent in his previous 2 matches, but against Selby, he never managed to string enough successful visits together. Fourth, the pressure completely changed. Robertson entered the tournament with the possibility of becoming world number 1 again. Selby entered the quarterfinal simply trying to win. Once Selby moved ahead, that pressure shifted dramatically. And finally, Selby was simply the better player on the day. Not slightly better, not lucky, not just more fortunate in 1 or 2 frames. He was significantly better. A 6-1 quarterfinal score against a player of Neil Robertson's quality says everything. For Robertson, the China Open ends with disappointment. He came to defend the title. He came with strong form. He came with a realistic chance of returning to world number 1. And instead, he leaves after one of the most one-sided defeats of his tournament. For Selby, however, the story is completely different. He continues his run. He has now produced back-to-back 6-1 victories. And more importantly, he has shown that he can combine his trademark tactical game with serious scoring power. That is a dangerous combination, because when Mark Selby is defending well, you already have a problem. When Mark Selby is scoring heavily, you have another problem. But when he is doing both at the same time, that is when he becomes almost impossible to stop. And Neil Robertson found that out the hard way. The defending champion was eliminated. The world number 1 opportunity disappeared. And Mark Selby sent a very clear message to everyone remaining at the China Open. If you want to beat him, you are going to have to play a lot better than Neil Robertson did today. Because this wasn't just a win, it was a statement. Mark Selby 6, Neil Robertson 1. And on this day in Taiyuan, there was never really any doubt who was in control.